They mocked the old Navy SEAL for the fortress of stone he built into the lonely Dakota hillside, calling it Hank's Folly, his doomsday castle. They watched him haul the granite and timber with his loyal German shepherd, Dutch, always at his side, and they laughed. But one winter day, his dog stopped dead, fixated on a sealed door deep in the cellar, refusing to move, as if he sensed a secret hidden in the stone. And when the worst blizzard in a century descended, the one the town never saw coming, the place they all laughed at became the only thing keeping every last one of them alive. What secret did the dog uncover in that silent place? And what did a quiet veteran know that everyone else had forgotten? We invite you to like this story, comment where you're watching from, and stay with us until the very end to find out. Hank Morgan's place wasn't a house so much as it was an anchor, sunk deep into the granite shoulder of a ridge overlooking Bitter Creek. From the valley, it looked like little more than a low-slung stone foundation, a stubborn chin of rock jutting out from the pines. But that was only the part he let the world see. The rest of it, the heart of it, was built down and back, following the natural seams of the earth. Hank, a man of 50 with the quiet economy of movement that comes from 2 decades in the Navy's most demanding corners, had built it all himself. He'd learned stonemasonry from his father and engineering from the unforgiving logic of the sea, and he'd poured every lesson into these walls. The stones were local granite, hauled one by one on a sled he'd fashioned, each fitted so tightly you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. The roof was a living thing, layers of sod and native grasses over a waterproof membrane and heavy timbers, so that in summer it blended with the hillside, and in winter it held a thick, insulating blanket of snow. His companion in all of it was Dutch, a German shepherd with a coat the color of sable and eyes that held a steady, knowing calm. The dog was more than a pet. He was a partner, a silent witness to the long years of labor. He had carried tools in his own saddle pack, stood guard over the cement mixer, and laid his heavy head on Hank's knee during the quiet evenings when the work was done. Inside, the fortress was a marvel of self-reliance. Its warmth didn't come from a propane tank that could freeze or a power line that could snap. It came from a Russian masonry heater, a massive brick and soapstone heart in the center of the main room. Hank fed it a slow diet of seasoned oak and pine, and the thermal mass radiated a gentle, bone-deep heat for 24 hours on a single firing. Light came from a small bank of marine batteries, charged by a modest solar array he kept swept clear of snow, but mostly he preferred the golden glow of kerosene lamps, their soft hiss a sound of deep comfort. Water was the true genius of the place. It came from a natural spring that trickled out of the granite deep within the hillside, captured in a stone cistern and fed by gravity to a single cast-iron pump in the kitchen. It was cold, pure, and utterly independent of the town's vulnerable well system. Food was everywhere, not in panicked stacks of cans, but in a carefully managed ecosystem of preservation. A root cellar, dug into the coldest part of the earth behind the main structure, held bins of potatoes, carrots, and onions. Shelves groaned with jars of vegetables from his summer garden, and cured meats hung from the rafters, smelling of salt and smoke. And in the back of that cellar, almost hidden behind a stack of firewood crates, was a heavy oak door, banded with iron and secured with 3 thick, hand-wrought bolts. It led to a part of the foundation his father had laid 60 years ago, a place Hank had never opened. It was the one piece of his own home that remained a mystery to him, a quiet inheritance he had not yet claimed. The town of Bitter Creek thought Hank Morgan was a fool, and they weren't quiet about it. The mockery was a low-grade fever in his life, something he had learned to carry without comment. It happened most often at Clara's General Store, the town's social and commercial hub. Dale Stubbs, a man whose face was perpetually flushed from either opinion or whiskey, was usually the one to start it. Dale owned the town's only bar, the Rusty Spur, and considered himself the final word on what was sensible and what was not. "Morning, Hank," he'd boom, his voice filling the small store as Hank set a bag of salt and a few machine parts on the counter. "Stocking up for the end of the world again? Let me know when the aliens land. I want to be sure my bar tab is paid." A few of the other men in the store, ranchers and mechanics who took their cues from Dale, would chuckle into their coffee cups. Hank would just nod, his eyes never leaving the worn wooden counter. He'd pay his bill to Clara, a widow in her late 40s with a quiet strength in her gaze, and she was the only one who never joined in. She'd hand him his change with a small, respectful nod, her expression one of weary understanding. She had seen a hard winter take her own husband years ago and knew that foresight was a virtue, not a sickness. "Thank you, Clara," Hank would say, his voice low and even. He'd gather his supplies, give Dutch a soft command to heel, and walk out into the wind, the laughter a dull noise at his back. He never defended himself. He never explained. What would he say? That he had spent years in places where the line between a hot meal and freezing to death was a single, well-maintained piece of equipment? That he had seen entire villages undone by one failed generator, one contaminated well? That he knew, in his bones, how thin the veneer of civilization was? They saw paranoia. He saw prudence. They saw a fortress. He saw a hearth. They saw a man wasting his life on a fool's errand, a strange hermit on the hill. He saw a promise he was keeping to his father, a man who had seen the sky turn black with dust and watched his neighbors starve. The mockery followed him down the main street, a shadow he had grown accustomed to. Men would nudge each other as his old truck rumbled past. "There goes the Admiral of Bitter Creek," they'd joke. "Bet he's got torpedo tubes in that bunker of his." Hank heard it all. He absorbed the whispers and the loud jokes, the pitying looks and the outright scorn, and he filed it away. He didn't hold it against them. They were good people mostly. They just hadn't seen what he'd seen. They lived in a world of presumed stability, where the power always came back on and the grocery store shelves were always full. His world had been different, and it had left a permanent mark on his soul, a deep and abiding respect for the simple, life-sustaining systems he was now mocked for building. He would just drive back up the winding dirt road to his stone house, Dutch resting his head on the center console, and get back to work. The reason for the fortress went deeper than his service. The discipline, the methodical planning, the understanding of systems under pressure that came from the Navy. It was the how. But the why was older, rooted in the very soil of the Dakotas. It was a legacy of quiet foresight passed down from his father, a man who spoke little but whose hands were always busy preparing for a winter that might never come, but one day surely would. Hank remembered his father, a stoic farmer, showing him how to bank a house with snow for insulation, how to read the thickness of an animal's coat, how to know by the taste of the air that a hard freeze was on its way. "The world forgets," his father used to say, his voice rough as burlap. "It gets comfortable, and it forgets what teeth the wind has." After his father passed, Hank had found his journals, filled not with feelings but with facts. Weather patterns, crop yields, notes on what failed and what held during the blizzards of 49 and 66. It was a gospel of preparedness. And then there was the sealed door in the cellar. For years, Hank had respected his father's silence on it, leaving it as a final, unopened chapter. But lately, Dutch had changed. The dog, normally content to sleep by the fire, began spending his evenings in the root cellar, lying with his nose pressed to the crack beneath the old oak door. At first, Hank tried to call him away, but the dog would not budge. Then came the low whines, a sound of deep insistence. Finally, one evening, Dutch began to scratch at the wood, a soft but relentless scraping that echoed in the quiet house. It was an act so out of character for the disciplined animal that Hank could no longer ignore it. He knew that a dog like Dutch didn't do things without reason. Setting down his lamp, he knelt beside his companion, running a hand over the dog's tense shoulders. "What is it, boy? What do you hear?" There was no sound but the wind outside. Trusting the dog more than his own senses, Hank made a decision. He retrieved a heavy pry bar and a sledgehammer from his workshop. The bolts were rusted tight, fused by decades of cold and damp. It took him the better part of an hour, the clang of steel on steel ringing through the stone chambers. But finally, with a groan of tortured metal, the last bolt gave way. The heavy door swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing not a room, but a narrow, stone-lined passage that sloped further down into the earth. A draft of cold, still air, smelling of dust and time, washed over him. With Dutch pressing close against his leg, Hank lit a second lantern and stepped across the threshold. The passage opened into a small, vaulted chamber cut directly from the bedrock. Stacked against the walls were wooden crates, sealed with wax, and on top of one, a tin box. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a letter written in his father's careful, blocky hand. "Henry," it began, "if you are reading this, the world has become loud enough that you sought out the quietest place I ever built. My father, your grandfather, lost everything in the Dust Bowl. He saw good families broken by one bad season. He swore it would not happen to us. He dug this chamber, and I added the stores. This is not for the end of the world. It is for the continuation of it. It is for our neighbors, even the ones who laugh. When the time comes, you'll know. Your job is not to survive. It is to help others survive. That is our family's work." Hank read the letter twice, the simple words landing with the weight of a lifetime. The crates were filled with medical supplies, heirloom seeds, tools, and preserved foods. His father hadn't been a hoarder. He had been a guardian, and the fortress Hank had built was not an end, but a beginning. The signs began subtly, as they always do. It started with the sky, which held a strange, pearlescent haze for days, a milky cast that muted the sun and made the horizon indistinct. The old-timers would have known it, a sign of immense cold pooling in the Arctic, waiting for the jet stream to buckle. But most people in Bitter Creek just thought it was pretty. Hank saw it and laid in another cord of oak. Then the animals began to move. The mule deer, usually content on the higher ridges until deep winter, started appearing in the lower valley, their coats unusually thick and dark. They moved with a nervous energy, browsing quickly before melting back into the trees. Hank watched them from his porch, Dutch a silent, rigid statue at his side. The dog could feel it too, a charge in the air that made the hairs on his neck prickle. He grew restless, pacing the perimeter of the house at night, his low growls more frequent. The squirrels, frantic and feverish in their work, stripped every pine cone bare and vanished into their nests weeks earlier than usual. The town's wells, which drew from the same aquifer, started to refill a little more slowly after heavy use, a sign the ground was beginning to freeze at a much deeper level than normal. Dale Stubbs laughed about it at the bar, saying his water pressure was down and he'd have to charge extra for a glass of water. No one connected the dots. Hank intensified his preparations with a quiet, methodical urgency. He wasn't panicked. He was simply moving through a checklist that had been forming in his mind for years. He climbed onto the roof and cleared the flue of his masonry heater, ensuring the draw was perfect. He double-checked the seals on every window and door, caulking any crack that could admit a whisper of wind. He brought in the last of his cured meats from the smokehouse and inventoried the jars in the root cellar, rotating the oldest to the front. He spent a full day in the chamber his father had built, organizing the supplies, familiarizing himself with the contents of each crate. He found hand-cranked radios, medical kits far more comprehensive than his own, and detailed instructions for setting broken bones and treating frostbite. He sharpened his axes and saws until they gleamed, stacking the split wood in precise, interlocking walls inside the covered porch. His movements were calm and efficient, the actions of a man who was not preparing for a disaster, but simply meeting an appointment he knew was coming. One afternoon, Elias Vance, an old rancher who lived on the far side of the county and rarely came to town, stopped his truck at the bottom of Hank's drive. Elias was a man who read the land like a book. He looked up at the sky, then at the thick plume of smoke rising from Hank's chimney. "Getting ready, Hank?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "You feel it too, then?" Hank replied. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded slowly. "My grandfather called this a wolf winter, the kind that comes to hunt." He tipped his hat and drove on, the brief exchange a confirmation of everything Hank already knew. The wolf was coming. The first flakes fell just after dusk, soft and fat and silent, the kind that promised a gentle blanket. People in town smiled, glad for a proper snow before Christmas. By midnight, the wind had risen to a steady, mournful howl. By dawn, the world had vanished. It was not a snowstorm. It was a blizzard, a ground-level hurricane of ice and wind that scoured the plains. The temperature plummeted past 0, then 10 below, then 20. The radio called it the worst polar vortex in 100 years. The power lines, heavy with ice and thrashed by the wind, were the first to go. They snapped with a sound like rifle shots, plunging the entire valley into a profound darkness and silence. Then the propane tanks began to fail. Propane needs to vaporize to be effective, and in the deep, sucking cold, now 35 below 0 before the wind chill, the liquid in the tanks grew sluggish, then stopped turning to gas. Furnaces sputtered and died. Pipes, deprived of the heat that kept them flowing, froze solid within an hour, then burst with dull, concussive thuds inside the walls of cabins and homes. People woke to houses that were rapidly becoming as cold as the air outside. They built fires in their fireplaces, but the wind, gusting to 60 miles per hour, drove the smoke back down the chimneys, filling rooms with choking soot. The cold was a physical presence, a predator. It found every crack, every poorly sealed window, every uninsulated wall. It leached the warmth from everything, from mugs of coffee, from blankets, from human bodies. Inside Hank's fortress, the world was a different place. The only sound was the soft hiss of the kerosene lamps and the contented crackle from within the masonry heater. The stone walls, 2 feet thick, held the howling wind at bay, reducing its roar to a distant murmur. The radiant heat from the massive brick stove filled the room with a steady, even warmth that no draft could penetrate. Dutch lay stretched out on the stone hearth, his tail thumping occasionally in his sleep. Hank sat at his heavy oak table cleaning a rifle, his movements unhurried. He had listened to the weather reports on his hand-cranked radio until the local station went off the air. He knew what was happening down in the valley. He could picture it with perfect clarity. The frantic search for blankets, the huddling of families in a single room, the growing dread as the firewood ran low and the cold crept deeper into their bones. His systems held. The gravity-fed spring provided a steady trickle of water, immune to the freeze. The pantry was full. The lamps were trimmed and bright. He moved through his home with a sense of calm purpose, checking the temperature, adding a log to the fire, watching the snow pile in deep, sculpted drifts against the windows. He was warm, he was fed, he was safe, and he was utterly alone, waiting. He knew they would come. It was not a matter of if, but when. And as the storm raged on, entering its second day, he found himself thinking of his father's letter. Your job is not to survive. It is to help others survive. The waiting was the hardest part. The first knock came late on the second night. It was not a knock so much as a desperate, muffled pounding. Dutch was on his feet in an instant, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but Hank silenced him with a quiet word. He unbarred the heavy door, leaning into it against the pressure of a newly formed snowdrift. The wind tore at him, a blast of crystalline cold that stole his breath. Silhouetted against the swirling white was a figure, crusted with snow, barely recognizable. It was Dale Stubbs. His face was a mask of frozen desperation, his usual flush replaced by a deathly pallor. Behind him, huddled in the cab of his half-buried pickup truck, were his wife and two small children. "Hank," he stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Hank, our furnace is dead. The pipes burst. It's as cold inside as it is out here. We're freezing." There was no mockery in his voice now, only the raw, stripped-down plea of a man at the end of his rope. Hank didn't hesitate. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't mention the years of jokes. He simply stepped back. "Get them inside," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Now." He helped Dale carry the children, who were wrapped in every blanket they owned, but were still shivering violently. He settled them on a rug before the great masonry heater, and the radiant warmth began to work its magic almost instantly. Dale's wife, her face etched with fear and relief, could only weep silently. Dutch, after a brief, cautious sniff of the newcomers, seemed to understand. He walked over to the youngest child, a little girl of 5, and lay down beside her, offering the thick warmth of his body. Dale's family was only the beginning. News in a small town travels by its own mysterious physics, even in a blizzard. Someone saw the light in Hank's window, a lone beacon in the frozen darkness. Someone else remembered the jokes about his bunker. Desperation is a powerful guide. Within hours, more headlights appeared, ghosting through the storm. The Millers, whose roof had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. Old Mrs. Gable, who lived alone and whose firewood was soaked. The young mechanic from the edge of town with his pregnant wife. Each time Hank opened the door without question, his spacious main room began to fill with the people of Bitter Creek, a huddled, humbled congregation drawn to the impossible warmth of his home. They came with shame in their eyes, the memory of their laughter still fresh. And Hank met them all with the same quiet dignity, offering a bowl of hot stew, a dry pair of socks, a safe place by the fire. He showed them the water pump, the pantry, the simple, unbreakable systems that were now keeping them alive. The fortress, once a symbol of his strangeness, had become their ark. The people who had called him a fool were now sleeping on his floor, their children safe under his roof, their lives dependent on the very foresight they had so casually ridiculed. And as he moved among them, refilling lamps and stoking the fire, Hank felt not vindication, but the quiet, profound satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. For 4 days, the blizzard held the valley in its grip. Outside, the world was an abstraction of wind and white. Inside Hank Morgan's stone house, a community was being forged in the warmth. The initial awkwardness and shame felt by the townspeople slowly melted away, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. People found jobs to do without being asked. The women organized the kitchen, making vast pots of soup and stew from Hank's stores, baking bread in the masonry oven. The men formed teams to keep the entrance clear of snow and brought in firewood from the covered porch, their movements crisp and efficient in the life-threatening cold. No one was idle. They were all survivors now, and survival was work. Dale Stubbs, stripped of his bluster, was a different man. He worked harder than anyone, his face set in a grim mask of repentance. On the 3rd day, he found Hank alone by the water pump, checking the gaskets. He stood there for a long moment, twisting his hat in his hands. "Hank," he said, his voice thick, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Dale," Hank replied, not looking up from his work. "No, I do," Dale insisted. "I was a fool, a loud, ignorant fool. I laughed at you. We all did. And you built this place. You were ready. You saved my kids. You saved all of us." He finally looked Hank in the eye. "I was wrong about you, Hank. I was wrong about everything. Thank you." Hank simply nodded, then handed Dale a wrench. "The seal on this pump needs tightening. Hold this." The apology was accepted, not with words, but with a shared task. Belonging was built in these small moments. It was built when the mechanic helped Hank rig a better ventilation system to handle the air for 30 people. It was built when Clara, who had arrived with a box of her store's remaining candles and medical supplies, organized a quiet space for the children to draw with charcoal on scraps of wood. It was built when Dutch moved calmly through the sleeping bodies at night, a furry, reassuring guardian. The mocked fortress proved its worth 100 times over. The masonry heater kept the entire space warm without consuming vast amounts of wood. The gravity-fed spring provided endless clean water. The root cellar and pantry fed them all without rationing. The systems Hank had so carefully designed, the ones born of his father's legacy and his own hard-won experience, did not fail. They held. And in the steady, quiet competence of the man they had misunderstood, the people of Bitter Creek found a new kind of leader. He didn't give speeches or issue commands. He simply worked, anticipated needs, and offered what he had without condition. The place they had called Hank's Folly had a new name now, spoken in whispers of gratitude. They called it the Shelter. And for the first time in years, Hank Morgan was not the strange man on the hill. He was the heart of a town that was refusing to die. When the wind finally died and a weak, watery sun appeared on the 5th day, the valley looked like a new and alien planet. The snow was piled in drifts 15 feet high, sculpting the landscape into soft, menacing shapes. The town of Bitter Creek was broken. Roofs had caved in, pipes had burst in nearly every home, and the silence was profound. But against all odds, everyone was alive. The community that had taken shelter in Hank's fortress emerged, blinking in the pale light, and began the slow, arduous process of digging out. They worked together, a cohesive unit now, sharing tools and labor, checking on the few homes that had managed to weather the storm. They found loss, livestock frozen in the fields, homes that would need to be rebuilt from the studs, but they had not lost a single person. And they knew precisely who they had to thank. The town didn't just rebuild, it remade itself in the image of Hank's foresight. People came to him not with mockery, but with notepads and questions. They asked about insulation, about masonry heaters, about cisterns and root cellars. He never lectured. He just answered their questions plainly, showing them the simple, sturdy principles he had used. That spring, the town council voted to use its emergency funds not just for repairs, but for resilience. They helped homeowners install secondary non-electric heat sources. They invested in a community well with a hand pump backup. They built a town root cellar modeled on Hank's, a shared pantry for the hard times everyone now knew could come. One man's private preparation had become the town's public wisdom. Years passed. The scars of the great blizzard faded into the land, but not from memory. It became the story they told their children, a modern legend of the wolf winter and the quiet man on the hill who had built an ark of stone. Hank Morgan lived out his days in his fortress, but he was no longer a hermit. People visited often, bringing gifts of smoked fish or fresh bread, or just coming to sit with him on his porch, watching the sky. Dutch grew old, his muzzle frosted with gray, and spent his final years sleeping peacefully on the warm hearth he had guarded so well. When Hank finally passed away in his sleep, Well into his 80s, the entire town mourned him. They buried him on the hillside next to his father, in the shadow of the house he had built. They didn't erect a fancy statue. Instead, the stonemason's son, a boy who had been saved in the shelter as a child, carved a simple plaque from a piece of local granite. They fixed it to the heavy oak door of the fortress, which had been deeded to the town as a community hall and emergency shelter. The plaque read, "Morgan's watch. He was ready, so we could be too." The strange choice of a man the town had misunderstood became the legacy that saved the whole valley, a testament to the idea that the deepest love is sometimes expressed not in words, but in stone and timber, and a warm, open door. In the end, the story of Hank Morgan and his fortress on the hill isn't just about a blizzard. It's a story about the quiet, steady work of preparation, and the kind of faith that drives a person to do the right thing, even when the world is laughing. It's a reminder that the people we overlook, the ones who seem strange or out of step with the times, are sometimes the very souls placed in our lives to act as guardians. They see the storm coming when the rest of us see only a pretty sky. They build shelters while the rest of us are busy building our fortunes. We all know people like that, the quiet helpers, the steady hands who prepare not out of fear, but out of a deep and abiding sense of duty and love for their fellow man. What quiet work are you doing in your own life that no one sees? We hope this story has warmed your heart. If it has, we'd be honored if you would like it. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. May you be blessed, and may you always be ready to open your door.